Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Hello and welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, Donald Trump facing another challenger for the Republican nomination. Does Joe Walsh stand a chance?
It's just not going to happen.
Short interview.
Yeah.
Also this week, are concerns over facial recognition technology really warranted?
And we could see this architecture of authoritarianism fall into the wrong hands.
And in the history department this week, the sliding door of Al Gore. Close, but no cigar.
And I'll take a reassuring look at the collapse of global free trade. But first, this.
Former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh of Illinois announced this week that he would challenge Donald Trump for the Republican Party's presidential nomination in 2020.
We have someone in the White House who we all know is unfit. Someone who lies virtually every time he opens his mouth. We cannot afford 4 more years of Donald Trump.
But unlike President Trump's other official challenger, former Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld, Joe Walsh is no pro-choice, moderate, northeastern Rockefeller Republican. He's a Tea Party conservative who previously backed Trump and has a history of anti-Islamic comments.
Congressman Joe Walsh under fire again for comments he made at a town hall meeting.
There is a radical strain of Islam in this country. It's not just over there, trying to kill Americans every week.
And Walsh also fed the birther movement, sending tweets like, "Obama is a Muslim, Happy New Year," and "Islam has conquered Europe without firing a shot." And not only did Walsh support Trump in 2016, he said that if Trump loses, he'll be grabbing his musket, Chaz.
Yeah, another time Walsh was reaching for his musket was when 5 cops were killed by some loon in Texas after a police brutality march in 2016. The black shooter had no link to Black Lives Matter, but Walsh still tweeted, "This is now war. Watch out, Obama. Watch out, Black Lives Matter punks. Real America is coming after you." Presidential.
That's a fluid term these days. Walsh even attacked the parents of the 6- and 7-year-old children killed in the Sandy Hook massacre in 2012, describing them as anti-gun partisans and saying that he has every right to criticise them. But now, as a candidate for the presidency, Joe Walsh says he regrets some of the things that he has said in the past.
Me and a bunch of people like me, we got ahead of ourselves and we engaged in this politics of personal destruction. I, speaking for myself, I would demonize my opponents. I would say bad personal things about President Obama, about Muslims, things that I regret.
Well, here's a new regret for Walsh. Walsh is probably best known for being fooled by Sacha Baron Cohen into endorsing a fictitious shooting program for small children. But Walsh said that he was told that the guns program was only supposed to be for Israel. When asked if there was any talk of importing the program to America, Walsh said, "Oh God, no." Well, it's a bad idea to lie about things that are on tape, Joe.
I endorse the Kindergartens program for all schools in America. If a child can pull the trigger of a video game controller or a Nerf gun, he can pull the trigger of an Uzi. It's obvious. Toddlers do not understand the consequences of their actions, meaning that, again, saving vital time, they will kill without hesitation, then kill again until all the bad guys are gone. The way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good child with a gun. Happy shooting, kids.
Happy campaigning, Joe.
Well, you know, Joe Walsh may not be the last Republican looking to challenge President Trump either. Former Congressman and former South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford, former Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, and former Ohio Governor John Kasich all reportedly mulling a potential White House run against Trump. But so far, it looks an almost impossible task. President Trump leading Bill Weld by more than 70 points in the average of polls. So, does Joe Walsh stand a chance against Donald Trump, or is this campaign about something else? Whit Ayres is one of America's most respected political consultants. He's worked on countless Republican campaigns for members of Congress and candidates for the presidency, including Marco Rubio. He's also the author of 2016 and Beyond, about the future of the Republican Party. He's no fan of Donald Trump, but he is also very much a realist on these matters. Whit Ayres, welcome back to Planet America.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.
So, what do you think of Joe Walsh running for president?
The real question is whether any challenge to an incumbent president is likely to be credible. No president in American history has been denied the nomination of his own party if he wants it. Not even former President Teddy Roosevelt, a wildly popular politician, was able to dislodge current incumbent President William Howard Taft from the Republican nomination in 1912. So if Teddy Roosevelt can't do it, a former one-term congressman no one has ever heard of is not going to do it.
Although historically, if a president is seriously challenged for renomination, they do tend to go on to lose the White House. Is that the objective here? Ruin Trump, lose the White House, but retake your party?
Yeah, we'll see. You're exactly right. When a serious challenger emerges, it weakens the incumbent president for the subsequent general election. That's what happened when Ronald Reagan challenged President Jerry Ford in 1976, when Teddy Kennedy challenged President Jimmy Carter in 1980, and when Pat Buchanan challenged President George H.W. Bush in 1992. All three presidents won renomination, but all three went on to lose the general election. But the challenge to have that effect needs to be serious and credible.
Do Walsh or Weld, for that matter, meet that standard of Buchanan, Kennedy or McCarthy?
Governor Weld was a very fine governor of Massachusetts years ago. But Governor Weld is a liberal Northeastern Republican. And liberal Northeastern Republicans are an extinct species in the United States today. A former congressman from the far right wing of the party, who's now a talk show host, doesn't quite rise to the level of a serious and credible challenger of a president who enjoys an 85% job approval in his own party.
Do you think Trump's more vulnerable on the right with Walsh or on the left with Weld?
Donald Trump at the moment is not vulnerable in the Republican Party because he has the overwhelming support of Republicans for renomination. It's a different story in the general election. A majority of Americans voted against Donald Trump in 2016. A majority of Americans disapprove of the job he has done ever since he took office. So if the Democrats are able to nominate a candidate who can unite the majority of the country that's non-Trump, then he's got a problem in the general election in 2020. But the Democrats seem to be very interested in nominating somebody from the far left wing of the party. At least many of the candidates come from the far left wing of the party. And it's going to be difficult for them to unite the non-Trump majority of the country.
Now, Trump's polling at about 80% against Weld alone, so how low would that number have to fall for it to have any impact on his general election performance, do you think?
It would have to come way down, 25, 30 points. Taking a Joe Walsh candidacy for the Republican nomination seriously is like taking a Marianne Williamson candidacy for the Democratic nomination seriously. It's just not going to happen.
So would somebody like Jeff Flake, Mark Sanford, John Kasich, or even Mitt Romney be a more serious rival to Trump?
Of course. Someone like that, someone of real political standing, former nominee Mitt Romney, who ran as the Republican nominee in 2012, someone like that would be a serious and credible contender. But many people who are serious and credible potential contenders are not likely to run against a president that enjoys such overwhelming support among Republicans today.
When we see Trump polling at around 90% amongst Republicans, is that an accurate reflection of his support, or is Trump purging the party of anti-Trumpers?
The straight answer to that question is yes. Donald Trump has taken over the Republican Party. And a number of people who used to call themselves Republicans, like the famous columnist George Will, no longer are willing to do so. So in many ways, Donald Trump dominates the Republican Party today and has made it the Trump Party.
As a Republican that has opposed Trump, what do you see beyond this president? What does the future look like?
I have real hope that the Republican Party will adapt to a rapidly changing America. I did Marco Rubio's presidential campaign in 2016. We had a rally in Charleston where Marco Rubio, Hispanic American conservative, Nikki Haley, Asian American conservative, Tim Scott, African American conservative, and Trey Gowdy, traditional white Southern guy conservative, all were on the stage together supporting Marco Rubio. I took a picture of that rally and said, this is the real future of the Republican Party that doesn't sacrifice any conservative principles, but presents a very different face of the party to the country and the world. That ultimately will be the future of the Republican Party.
That's pretty much the future that was being anticipated by the 2012 post-mortem after Romney lost. Is that the future you still anticipate, or is the Republican Party heading towards a narrower, whiter, less electable future?
That, of course, is the real question as we look forward. But the Republican Party will inevitably have to adapt to a very different America in order to be successful in the long run. Donald Trump slipped the demographic punch in 2016, but you can't slip that punch forever and be successful.
Witez, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be with you.
The polls for the Democratic presidential nomination are all over the place this week. Biden leading by double digits in 5 polls, single digits in 2, and actually trailing in 1. Average that out and he is still at around a 12-point lead this week. That Monmouth poll, though, with Biden behind Warren and Sanders, it was a weird one. And we'll talk about that a bit in our Planet America Extra. Meanwhile, another 2 candidates you've probably never heard of have dropped out of the presidential race. So let's play everyone's favourite game.
Guess who won't be president?
And bowing out, it's New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand.
I know this isn't the result we wanted. We wanted to win this race. But it's important to know when it's not your time and to know how you can best serve your community and country. I believe I can best serve by helping to unite us to beat Donald Trump in 2020.
The 52-year-old former lawyer had replaced Hillary Clinton in the Senate from New York. She failed to qualify for next month's 3rd round of Democratic candidate debates. She championed women's equality and says she will endorse a candidate in this primary, just not yet, but strongly hinted that would be a female candidate. Gillibrand, best known perhaps for calling on former Senator Al Franken to resign over allegations of inappropriate touching and kissing. And it's fair to say, Chaz, that some Democrats never really forgave her for her part in all of that. They thought that maybe she and others got caught up in the Me Too movement.
Look, I think there's a lot of reasons why the Gillibrand campaign never quite took off. My personal favourite was represented by this post, Gillibrand's Instagram post from Pride Day. So authentic, John. They just happened to catch her on camera relaxing in a bar and randomly shouting out, "Gay rights!"
Sure, we all do that. Now, also bowing out this week was Seth Moulton, who? The 40-year-old Massachusetts congressman, triple Harvard graduate and Iraq War veteran. He has called on other long shots as well to get out of the race. Telling the New York Times this week, I think it's evident that this is now a 3-way race between Biden, Warren and Sanders. And really, it's a debate about how far left the party should go. Moulton doesn't think it should go very far left at all. His departure prompted a sarky tweet from the president.
The Dow is down 573 points, perhaps on the news that Representative Seth Moulton, whoever that may be, has dropped out of the 2020 presidential race.
Perhaps that fall on the markets had more to do with the Trump administration's ongoing trade war with China. It was certainly one of the main talking points at this week's G7 meeting of leading economies in Biarritz in the south of France. There were some surprises at the summit, including the appearance of the Iranian foreign minister at the invitation of the French President Emmanuel Macron. President Trump refused to meet with the Iranians. The summit broke up for the first time ever without even an attempt at issuing a joint communique. For all the talk of unity, the president also pointedly skipped a meeting of leaders on climate change. He said he had to meet with India's Prime Minister Modi and Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel, except they were both at the climate meeting. And when it comes to China, President Trump maintains he's winning.
We've picked up $20 trillion in worth, and China has lost $20, $25, $30 trillion in worth. We're now almost double the size of the economy.
President Trump says he wants to see Russia return to the former G8 as well after being expelled in 2014 following their annexation of Crimea. And he also wants next year's summit to be held at a Trump resort in Florida.
Of course he does. But back to the trade war, where the rhetoric has been heating up. It started when Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell gave a speech in which he made the unremarkable point that trade uncertainty is playing a role in the global slowdown and that there are no recent precedents for what Powell can do to fix it. Well, that was far short of Pence-level sycophancy, but Trump was mindful of the independence of the Fed, so he showed admirable restraint and refrained from being seen to inappropriately... Oh, of course he didn't!
Who is our bigger enemy, Jay Powell or Chairman Xi?
So, after confusing his hand-picked chairman with an enemy of the state, Trump then confused himself with a ye olde town crier, saying our great American companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China. Now, most people took that order pretty lightly until Trump doubled down, insisting that people should try looking at the Emergency Economic Powers Act. Case closed. Well, okay. Let's do that. Firstly, to use the powers of the Act, you need to deal with an unusual and extraordinary threat that shall be based on the declaration of an emergency. Now, I wouldn't say Trump engaging in a genitals measuring competition with Chairman Xi counts as an unusual and an extraordinary threat, but let's say a court gives Trump the benefit of the doubt about that, and they might. Then Trump could declare a national emergency and he'd be fine. Except, to declare an emergency in every possible instance, the president needs to consult with Congress and consult regularly with them about it, which Trump obviously hasn't done, so he doesn't have the power to do jack. But let's say he did follow the law. What if tomorrow he supplies Congress with all the information he's supposed to and they gave him the go-ahead, and then he declares a national emergency? Then he has the power to regulate transactions involving any property in which any foreign country has any interest. In other words, he arguably could possibly force companies to leave China, just like he said. Whoa! Between those dictatorial musings and the relentless escalating tit-for-tats between China and America, this trade war is starting to become a big deal. But is it worth it? To the wall!
Big, beautiful wall.
The trade war is back in the news, and you know what that means? It's panic time! But what exactly are we panicking about? By the end of the year, America says they'll be charging 30% tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods and 15% tariffs on $300 billion worth of goods, whereas China will charge something between 5 and 30% on $185 billion worth of American goods. So you can see that America has bigger guns in this war, especially given...
You're not paying for those tariffs. China's paying for those tariffs.
Well, no. According to Goldman Sachs, the inflation rate of a bunch of tariff-affected goods since the tariffs hit has been significantly higher than the inflation rate for all the other goods. And that tariff money there that American consumers are paying isn't even useful. The $19 billion brought in by tariffs up to June was more than matched by the $25 billion that the administration paid out to farmers in compensation subsidies. Well, at least some businesses, though, are moving operations back to America, yeah? Maybe a little. But a lot of the $25 billion fewer dollars of Chinese imports this year were matched by extra imports from other low-cost countries like Mexico, Vietnam, and Taiwan. That's $23 billion there. Even tariffs that were specifically targeted to help an industry like steel aren't doing too much good. So, if the tariffs aren't helping, how much are they hurting? Let's start with the farmers. We've seen a lot of these kinds of stories about a trifecta of low soybean, corn and pork prices, and it is true. Soybean prices, for instance, have dropped, you see? Except that was in 2014. This is the price drop after the trade war started. It's not great, but it's not that. Similarly, corn had a bigger drop in prices in 2014 than because of the trade war as well. Although in this case there were also greater price drops before 2014. But what happened in 2014? Well, the dollar went up a lot after the Federal Reserve stopped their quantitative easing program, and don't worry what that means. The most important thing is that the dollar going up is what smashed the prices for farmers, and the tariffs made an already bad situation that little bit worse. Even worse for soy farmers, China's pigs are dying from swine fever, with projections of China losing about half their pigs by the end of the year. That's almost a quarter of the world's pork supply. And what did those pigs eat? Soy meal. So even America's competitor, Brazil, is selling China 31% less soybeans than they were this time last year. Too many dead pigs. But at least America can sell them pigs then. No. America feeds most of its pigs ractopamine, a feed additive that's banned in China, Russia and Europe, which once again is the main reason that America's pig exports dropped off, not the trade war. So farmers are doing it tough. Blaming that on the tariffs is unfair, but the trade war sure doesn't help. Okay, what about China? Well, the tariffs have certainly impacted Chinese exports to America. They've fallen from $250 billion in the first half of last year to $220 billion in the first half of this year. But how does $30 billion compare to the $1.3 trillion that China spent trying to support their markets in 2015 alone? The trade war seems kind of small fry by comparison, but there's a reason for all that stimulus. It's because the Chinese economy has been slowly stagnating for years. I know it might not look like it, but 6.2% is actually the slowest growth that China's seen for 27 years. And the stimulus is having less and less effect. That growth is slowing down right when China happens to be sitting on a giant debt bubble. 300% of their GDP, or $40 trillion. So $60 billion fewer exports a year is not China's biggest problem. But once again, it doesn't help. Finally, America. Now, America is not a big trading country. It has fewer exports and fewer imports as a percentage of GDP than most of its peers, which means it's less affected by trade wars. But given that America just burnt $1 trillion of taxes to achieve this boost in investment, they probably don't need the largest amount of trade uncertainty since 1994. It doesn't help. And given that economic forecasters are already revising their growth forecast downwards, it's probably not great that the CBO is projecting the trade war will reduce GDP by 0.3% and reduce average incomes by 0.4%, and that was before the recent escalations. It's especially concerning because America currently has its own debt bubble, a corporate debt bubble, which is even more inflated than it was before the GFC. So if America does move into recession, the stock market could crash quite badly. Just that little nudge from the trade war might be the decisive push. So there's no need to panic about the trade war, but it really, really doesn't help.
We've talked before about the fairly poor record that vice presidents and former vice presidents have in becoming president. Historically, around 1 in 3 have made it. Not great odds, and part of the reason why Vice President Jack Garner famously said the job wasn't worth a warm bucket of spit. Vice President Al Gore, though, came very, very close to the presidency. He fell less than 600 votes short in 2000. And we can only ponder how the world might have been different on issues like climate change and the war on terror. Al Gore had just turned 39 when he announced his first presidential campaign in April 1987. The senator from Tennessee was no newcomer. He'd served 3 terms in the House, 1 in the Senate. He'd literally grown up in Washington, D.C. His father, Al Gore Sr., was a member of Congress for 32 years. Summers on the family tobacco farm ensured the younger Al Gore retained a Tennessee drawl and Southern appeal, although growing up in the 60s meant he had a confession to make.
For approximately 15 years, I have not tried marijuana. I have never used it at any time since I entered public office.
A little awkward given Gore was trying to appeal to conservative voters.
This part of North Carolina is home to conservative Democrats, who in recent years have been known to vote for conservative Republicans. Today, Al Gore asked them to try a conservative Democrat this time.
That's why I need your help to be the nominee, to reach out for the independently thinking voters who sometimes have left our party in the past and who need to rejoin that great coalition.
Al Gore won primaries in his home state of Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, Arkansas and Oklahoma. Out west he took Nevada and Wyoming, but dropped out after only winning 10% of the vote in New York. Gore's 1988 campaign looked to many like an audition for the vice presidency.
I did not get into this race to pursue the vice presidency.
In fact, Gore was on the shortlist for Mike Dukakis, but ultimately passed over in favour of Senator Lloyd Bentsen of Texas. Gore had been expected to run for president again in 1992, but opted out after his 6-year-old son, Albert Jr., was nearly killed leaving a baseball game.
He pulled out of my hand and ran across just as a car came zooming through an opening in the crowd and hit him very badly.
Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton won the Democratic nomination, and his search for a running mate focused on members of Congress. He picked Al Gore for his foreign policy and environmental credentials. Being a fellow Southerner and baby boomer, Gore helped to underscore Bill Clinton's campaign for generational change and a more centrist approach by Democrats.
They're a new generation of Democrats, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and they don't think the way the old Democratic Party did. They've called for an end to welfare as we know it, so welfare can be a second chance, not a way of life.
After they defeated President Bush, Gore established himself as one of Bill Clinton's top advisors, as well as working on special projects like the modernisation of government. Gore was popular, but still had a reputation for being fairly wooden.
How can you tell Al Gore from a room full of Secret Service agents? He's the stiff one.
At least he could joke about it. As the sitting vice president, Al Gore was Bill Clinton's heir apparent in 2000, yet tried to distance himself from the scandals of the Clinton years.
With your help, I will take my own values of faith and family to the presidency to build an America that is not only better off, but better.
Gore had only one serious Democratic rival, New Jersey Senator Bill Bradley, who ran as a more progressive alternative to the centrist Clinton-Gore years. Polls in late 1999 showed Gore leading Bill Bradley by 25 points, 58-33, and Gore won the Iowa caucuses in late January by almost 2-1.
We've just begun to fight.
And Gore certainly had a fight on his hands 8 days later in the New Hampshire primary.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Gore won, but by just 4 points, and 4 days later, Bradley won more than 40% of the vote in Delaware. The former basketball star wasn't going quietly, or without sporting analogies.
Getting in the fourth quarter, we're a little behind. Now we come from behind, put the full court press on.
It wasn't until Al Gore won more than 80% of the vote in the California primary in March that the VP could start to breathe a little easier. Meanwhile, the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, had fended off his own scare in New Hampshire to beat Senator John McCain to the Republican nomination. The stage was set for Bush v. Gore. The economy was strong, America was at peace, yet Governor Bush's brand of compassionate conservatism seemed to be resonating with an electorate looking for change. A poll in early August had Al Gore and his running mate Joe Lieberman trailing Bush and his nominee for Vice President Dick Cheney by 17 points.
Thank you.
But by the time the Democratic convention was over just 2 weeks later, Gore was 1 point in front. The first head-to-head debate didn't go Gore's way. Bush benefited from low expectations and Gore suffered from his obvious exasperation.
I've had a record of appointing judges in the state of Texas. That's what a governor gets to do.
And in the second debate, there was a weird moment when Gore wandered up to Bush, who seemed completely unfazed.
It's not only what's your philosophy and what's your position on issues, but can you get things done? And I believe I can.
The polls stayed close throughout the rest of the 2000 campaign, with Bush just in front heading into Election Day.
Stay with us. We're about to take you on an exciting and bumpy ride.
And boy, was Tom Brokaw right. First NBC, then CNN called Gore the winner in Florida, putting him on track for victory. Then they retracted it.
NBC News is now taking Florida out of Vice President Gore's column and putting it back in the too close to call.
Then Fox News led the networks in calling Florida for Bush, putting him over the 270 electoral votes he needed for the presidency. But there were only a few hundred votes in it.
Our knees are beginning to wobble a little on that. Al Gore has 249. The man who wins Florida becomes the next president.
Al Gore called Bush to concede. Then, as the count tightened again, Gore called him back to withdraw his concession. It was recount time. Discarded votes, hanging chads, dimpled chads and butterfly ballots were all argued over until, more than a month later, the US Supreme Court put an end to the recount, with Gore trailing by just 537 votes, effectively handing the election to George Bush.
While I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College.
And so it was. Gore had no other choice, and his presidential dream was over.
Thank you, and good night, and God bless America.
Facial recognition is here. Since 2011, the FBI has logged more than 390,000 facial recognition searches from federal and local databases. They access criminal records, they access driver's licenses and ID cards. Their network extends to 641 million facial photos, and no legislature has authorised a thing. Already, some companies are in court stealing photos from social networking platforms for law enforcement purposes, including photos from protests to identify the protesters. In New York toll booths, they've been experimenting with technology that identifies you by your ear if you turn your head. But the undisputed king of facial recognition is China, where they use it for smile-to-pay systems, to screen staff and students at unis, and to limit toilet paper dispensing in public toilets. Chinese police even say they've used facial recognition to identify and arrest a man at a concert with 50,000 people in the audience. But it's also in China that we see the dark side of facial recognition. They use the technology in their surveillance cameras to track Uyghurs, a Muslim minority, and to keep records of their comings and goings, ushering in what some call an era of automated racism. Having said that, the technology to date might not be quite as reliable as China would have us believe. 8 trials were carried out in London over 2 years, resulting in an average false positive rate of 96%. In New York, they tested how the technology performed on bridges for people driving cars, and they found 0 faces being detected within acceptable parameters. Another thing about facial recognition, when it fails, it tends to fail in a certain kind of way, like when Google's recognition technology mistakenly labelled black people as gorillas, and when Amazon's recognition program accidentally confused 28 members of Congress with criminal mugshots. At the time, 20% of Congress were people of colour, and 39% of the false matches were people of colour. Although, to be fair, one of those false matches was this guy, who had gotten away with body slamming a reporter. So, well done, Amazon! Now, Amazon said the results would have been improved if people used their 99% confidence threshold option. But when Gizmodo spoke to the Washington County Police, who do use Amazon's facial recognition software in real life, they replied, "We do not set, nor do we utilise any confidence threshold." So now it seems the facial recognition backlash is on. Hong Kong protesters carry umbrellas wherever cameras are. Special shirts have been invented that confuse recognition software, and so do these reflective glasses. 50% of Americans in a recent poll wanted limits placed on the use of facial recognition software by law enforcement, and some authorities are listening. 3 cities have already banned the government use of facial recognition, and now Bernie Sanders has called for a ban on police use of facial recognition as well. But are these concerns going too far? Some law enforcement types say facial recognition is valuable to combat threats in schools and airports, to identify people at ports of entry, and it's also a valuable investigative tool to solve crimes. In fact, police say it was only through the use of facial recognition technology that they finally identified the Capital Gazette shooter. Well, as always with surveillance, Britain is a step or two further down the road than America is. So we're now joined from London by Silkie Carlo, Director of Privacy Campaign Group Big Brother Watch. Silkie, on one hand we hear about UK trials where facial recognition had a 4% hit rate, but then we hear about China picking a criminal out of a 50,000 person crowd. What's the truth about the accuracy of facial recognition technology? Is one of these groups lying, or is China just better at facial recognition than the West is?
At the moment, the definitive latest figures in the UK for police use here is that over 80% of the matches, in fact, wrongly misidentify innocent members of the public as potential criminals. So it's overwhelmingly, staggeringly inaccurate at the moment. But that's not to say that it's not going to get better, because it certainly is. And live facial recognition surveillance has a unique problem of being both bad when it fails and bad when it works, because when it works, as it will do in the future, it has the potential to be the perfect tool of oppression that can track and monitor everyone and who they associate with and where they go at all times, and that's why we oppose it.
So what are your chief concerns about law enforcement using facial recognition?
In the UK, we've had police using live facial recognition to surveil big public spaces since 2015, and they started with a high degree of secrecy, which is what I think other people across the rest of the world should look out for when this begins. We've now got big areas of London that are under facial recognition surveillance that no one knew about, that we found out about through freedom of information requests and other investigative methods. And that now means that there are tens of millions of people in the UK who have had their faces scanned, their data taken, data that's as sensitive as the data that's on your passport, and we don't know where it's going, what's being done with it, or why it's being taken. Some have said this might have a chilling effect on the freedom of political discussion. Could you talk through how that might happen? One of the first times that we saw police using facial recognition in the UK was at a peace demonstration. You've got peaceful activists who are being tracked with facial recognition vans, who haven't committed any crime whatsoever. And I think obviously part of that is to create a chilling effect and let people know that they're being watched. Really interesting to see in recent weeks protesters in Hong Kong wearing masks, using umbrellas to shield their faces from surveillance cameras that they fear have facial recognition technology, and then eventually actually soaring down lampposts that have face recognition cameras on them, because clearly they are there to punish protesters down the line and to record their activities. It will have a devastating effect on democracies if used in that way. Isn't facial recognition like any other law enforcement technique, though, in that if it's unregulated, it'll be abused badly, but if you regulate it properly, it could potentially be more benign, like maybe establish a warrant system for its use or something like that? It depends what type of facial recognition. But with live facial recognition, where you've got cameras in public spaces that are tracking everyone that walks past the camera, that inherently doesn't work in a democracy, because what it does, it effectively creates an identity checkpoint that most people won't even notice or know about, that potentially millions of people walking past will have their biometric data taken, recorded, analysed. It is like having a fingerprint checkpoint, or, you know, the example from earlier in the 20th century of show me your papers. We don't do that in democracies. We don't have arbitrary identity checks, but that's what live facial recognition surveillance does. And there's no amount of regulation that can stop it inherently being a mass surveillance tool when used in that way.
So what kind of facial recognition do you think could be potentially more acceptable in the future?
Many of us are already used to facial recognition checks at the borders. There's still some controversy around it, but it is widely used. And I think in a scenario where you expect to be subjected to an identity check, then there can be a place for facial recognition. But the idea of using it to recognise everyone and conduct identity checks on everyone turns us all into walking ID cards.
What about all the good that widespread facial recognition could achieve? Like, for instance, identifying terrorists or finding missing people. What would be your response to those kinds of arguments?
In a world that is completely surveilled, there will be good things you can achieve. I mean, of course, if we all had cameras in our homes, you could do a pretty good job on stamping out domestic violence and responding to it, or we could all be microchipped and then you would never have a missing person. But in any free society, we need to maintain a few democratic principles and essentially our human rights. And I do worry that there is a growing attitude that privacy is something of the past and we don't need it in the future world, and I sincerely believe we do.
Why the focus on police? Can't facial recognition be just as abused in the hands of the private sector?
Absolutely. It just so happens in the UK, police started using facial recognition really before everyone, and I think therefore police have thrown open the floodgates to its use by using it since 2015 in absence of any legal basis. What we found quite recently is that there is now an epidemic in the UK of private companies using face recognition technology, for example, in shopping malls, even in museums, places that you wouldn't necessarily expect it, conference centres, casinos, all kinds of places that are taking masses of data from members of the public. There, the use is quite insidious, really, because we're not even talking about criminal watch lists. It's private security companies that add people to those watch lists. So you can be a perfectly innocent citizen of your country and yet be hounded, monitored, tracked, recorded by private facial recognition companies. That creates a real worry for us. But it is important to say, actually, even with the police use, they claim that they just look for criminals, and we've seen that that's absolutely not the case. Even on the second use of the Metropolitan Police in London, their second use of facial recognition, they used to track people that they thought had mental health problems. This is beyond dystopian, and I think is a quite a stark reflection of the fact that when you have such a potentially oppressive and inherently quite rights abusive technology, it will be used in ways that are extraordinary like that.
Silky Carlo, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Okay, cool, thank you.
And with that, it's time for these two faces to recognise we're out of time for another week.
Yes, you can see everything we missed on the Extra, Facebook and iView. See you there.
Bye.
Bye.